Good evening. Welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those joining the program for the first time, my name is Rina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is Donald Bowser, hailing from Canada. He is the core global Ukraine country director, and we'll talk about the organization and what it does in a few minutes. And we're here to discuss the situation in Ukraine, the counteroffensive, that's going, the humanitarian issues, and how they're being handled, and of course, psyops, and is the information warfare front in this war. Who is succeeding, who is failing, and what needs to be done more of, less of, and by which stakeholders in the situation. Donald, thank you for joining us today. If you could tell us a little bit about your own background to the audience and how you also got involved in Ukraine-related issues.
Sure. Well, as a budding Sovietologist back in the late 80s, I set up an exchange program. We wrote to every university in the Soviet Union, and we only got two serious answers: Perm in the Ural Mountains and Odessa on the Black Sea. So it was kind of a no-brainer. We picked Odessa, and I landed there in 1990. So since then, been very actively engaged in Ukrainian affairs over the last 33 years, helped with the independence movement, and almost got kicked out of the Soviet Union for my efforts of helping RUK and other groups in Ukraine. And since then, been coming or going in different capacities over the years. And then from 2014 to 2020 was full-time, mostly based in Kiev. And yeah, since the start of the war, I volunteered and went out and basically was delivering non-lethal military assistance, and then formed an organization that was looking at helping frontline communities. So that's my sort of Ukraine background. And in general, what I do is anti-corruption work, governance work, research and analysis work, and hence has led me to my current position as country director for an organization that does research and analysis.
So there's a lot to unpack there. I kind of want to back a bit to the 90s, to the independence movement, and to the early years of independence of Ukraine. One of the core issues about this conflict has been Russia's claims at various points in time that Ukraine is not a real country, or that its history is tightly intertwined with Russia, or that for whatever reason it should not have independence. Now, back in the 90s, when the Soviet Union fell apart, everyone was quick to celebrate the end of the Cold War and the independence of the newly formed republics. Russia, however, from what I understand, retained strong political and cultural influence at the time. Now we're seeing increasing rejection of that influence, especially by Ukrainians themselves, which kind of sparked this debate in the West about identity, about the legitimacy of these claims, and about whether any of these former Soviet republics, just how independent are they, just how far back in history do we need to go back to make those claims. And essentially, there's been this increasing talking point in the West propagated by pro-Russia sympathizers that at the very least it's not our business to intervene in these claims, and that essentially it's a those countries on their own. Your experience in the region since the very beginning of this independence, what can you tell us about kind of what's an understanding of the potency of the pro-independence?
Yeah, well, I saw it all sort of firsthand in the Soviet Union about the different sort of movements towards independence. there were many different levels in terms of Ukraine, right? So there was a strong independence movement that was there, based mostly from diaspora people who had been in Western Ukraine. Odessa was its own planet. And it's the very nature of Ukraine, is that each region is its own reality. Kharkov was its own thing, right? Former capital always felt themselves not beholden to Kiev. Donbass was its own thing, very working class, very oriented towards the east, right? So Western Ukraine, Central Ukraine, completely different. So the decentralized nature of Ukraine was different attitudes towards independence. What does independence mean? So when Ukraine became independent in 1991, when I went back in 1993, basically the rector of the university demanded a very large bribe to continue my studies, so I had to take the time out. And then so when I went back in 93, still pretty much all of the Soviet institutions were still functioning as Soviet institutions. The difference between that and the Baltic states, where they had a living memory of independence, those institutions were being set up in the late 80s. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia were sending people over to the US to actually work in those embassies under the guise of studying, but they were working in the independent Baltic embassies that existed in order to develop their own core. Or when I visited Vilnius in January of 1991, when the very tragic events happened, you could see that people were preparing for independence. The same thing in Estonia in the summer of 91 as well, is that people were preparing their own approaches. There was a Chamber of Commerce set up. You know, I mean, all of these other things, institutions were being set up already then. Ukraine under Kravchuk kind of fell asleep, and independence was only sort of recognized a little bit later on down the road. The first 5 years of Ukrainian independence weren't really about being setting up institutions. It was about survival. So things like the Crimea question, when I did my master's thesis in 1995, I looked at the Crimea question, and the Russians had a very concrete plan to seize Crimea and things had ever gone not the way they wanted. So this was all pre-established. The Massandra agreement between Ukraine and Russia was basically forced on Ukraine after a period of being disconnected from natural gas and heating resources during the winter. So all of these attempts to make sure that the countries nearby Russia stayed within Russia's orbit were largely pre-written. The same thing in the Caucasus as well. Conflict was generated through Stalinist policies, and that Stalinist policies managed to create violence, which allowed Russia to maintain some sort of control up into the Chechen War, when they had the first real attempt to sort of break away. So you saw different paths to independence. Tajikistan got involved in civil war. They had no reason to be independent. They had no desire. They had no institutions. They didn't even have a functioning army. And that's why civil war broke out, because there was nobody to enforce things. Kyrgyzstan as well, sort of like, we want to stay, but they didn't get the choice and they got voted out. Right, so you only saw Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia negotiating for the rest of even though there were strong independence movements in Georgia, for example. And I was there shortly after the violence broke out in Tbilisi, and I had a lot of friends who were wounded during the crackdown. So we saw that there were this genesis, but preparing the institutions that would allow you to be successful in being independent took a very long time. And in fact, up until 2014, I would argue that there were very few genuine Ukrainian institutions. Most of it was cut and paste from Soviet, Russian sort of laws and things like that, and they copied very closely things. And only after 2014 did you really start to see genuine Ukrainian institutions be established.
No, it's very interesting, because another infamous talking point is about the alleged intervention of the West in Ukraine and this attempt to chart its course towards Western orientation. But from what you're telling me, it sounds that up until 2014, there was actually fairly, the Western involvement has been fairly limited, and Ukraine was very much left to its own devices, so to speak. And if anyone was actually looking to maintain any sort of external foreign policy there, it was Russia and not the United States and other Western countries.
Yeah, I mean, what we saw after the Orange Revolution is we saw a period of where, yes, there was an attempt to sort of establish their own way, but that very quickly became co-opted, right? Yanukovych was around then, and Yanukovych was the main agent for Russia. When Yanukovych got into power, what did he do? Complete Russification of Ukrainian security services. So I have a lot of friends who came out of the intelligence service or the armed forces, and they just left because they could not handle the Russification process that was going on. That was one of the things that we saw in 2014, which is why Ukraine was disabled in terms of responding to the Russian threat. And then again in 22 is that so many people had been co-opted by Russia within the Ukrainian security services. Now we finally see a true cleansing of Ukrainian institutions of Russian influence. But yes, through the history of it, Ukraine was always a sideshow. And so this was always what was frustrating, is that because most of the policy for the former Soviet zone was dictated by people who were Moscow-centric, it became very difficult. So you only had two sort of groups, those that were completely Moscow-centric or those that had no experience in the region. There were a very limited number of people who were specialists on Central Asia or on Ukraine outside of the diaspora, right? So policy making was always dictated. And a good friend of mine who was the Georgian ambassador to the UK and head of the Georgian foreign ministry for Western countries was always frustrated by this. Said, you know, why is everything always dictated by this Moscow-centric approach? And it's very valid.
Now, there is a cadre of Western thinkers who believe that everything that ever happens anywhere, independence movement or grassroots movement or also any social movement of any sort, all of it is the product of Western security services. And it's hard to sometimes impart on these people that countries have their own agencies for what it's worth. A lot of the current Ukrainian some of the rules were in a very strong anti-Yanukovych reaction. Those of us who visited former Yanukovych digs can tell you about his can tell a lot about the level of absolute corruption that he was mired in. But nevertheless, how was it that Yanukovych was able to co-opt these institutions so quickly, and what exactly was he imposing? What sort of changes? What did this Russification process consist of that made it so difficult for later administrations to come in and undo?
Well, you know, the reaction to the colored revolutions was very strong on the part of Russia. They understood that countries were losing their grip, and then they started these campaigns to look at ways that they would be able to undermine the institutions. The problem that existed was, you know, the government in 2005, 2006 in Ukraine was also trying to reform, looking to ways to reform, but at the same time had many people in it whose interest was their own private interest and was not actually in Ukraine's interest. And you can look at people like Vlad Kastyev, you know, came out of the Para movement, the big hero of the West as the leader of the students and everything else, who ended up becoming, you know, a grifter on such a scale that was sort of unprecedented up until his arrest in Panama. By the way, he's now back in Ukraine, and he's a member of the council in the Carpathian region. So this was a guy who had many
Interesting.
active corruption cases on him. He was at the Ministry of Energy. He was involved in. So all you had to do was capture individuals, even those that are professing their love for Ukraine, and be able to manipulate them.
That brings me to sort of a kind of the core of our discussion on corruption and what it means, because this issue of long-standing corruption and a lot of it coming in from the culture of the Soviet Union that was never properly eradicated, it has been used as an argument by isolationists to not interfere in Ukraine, not provide assistance, and basically say that the whole issue is hopeless. It's a hopelessly, corrupt case, and that the country has even, basically facilitated corruption here in East. Of course, the more specific reference to all of this is the Burisma case, where, as we now find, the head of Burisma, the founder of Burisma, was actually a Russian asset, which attempts to corrupt everything and control all these institutions. But there is also a larger political point aside from one particular, corrupt company, which is the poor understanding of the differences between the different administrations in the for Western listeners. Sort of tend to merge into one. I really remember Yushchenko ended up being so much from the government, who was lauded as pro-Western, but who was also had a reputation of being horribly corrupt, and who is actually now charged with treason. And of course, there is the current administration, which from almost the very beginning of its start first fell right into COVID, and then the war. So what can we talk about these administrations and their efforts to counter this, their combat with this battle with this corruption issue, with the Russification issue, and the pro-Western orientation? Where do we draw the line between this long-standing endemic corruption that will take time to root out and specific choices made by these administrations?
Well, look, having been on the forefront for the last 25 years in Ukraine's efforts to fight corruption, I started in 1997 with Minister of Justice Galavati, who was trying to have Operation Clean Hands and start the anti-corruption movement. Very little political will has existed to actually do something about this. Can we link this together with some sort of betrayal of Ukraine? Yes, in a macro scale, but the fact is a lot of people who proclaim their love of Ukraine and have covered themselves with nationalism are the guys who are stealing the most. Mm-hmm. My point last week, actually, to Ukrainian activists was, going after NATO and saying NATO is not doing enough to help us, or Western countries are not doing enough to help us, ignores the very fact that currently, for example, with the military commissar of Odessa, he took out about $6 million and bought himself a very nice villa since the conflict erupted. So in the last 18 months, he's been able to accumulate $6 million, most of it selling ways out of the military, plus doing whatever deals he has to do. So to me, the people that are stealing from the Ukrainian army, the people that are stealing humanitarian aid, the people that are stealing from Ukrainian institutions are far more traitorous than anybody else in the country when it's a time of war. Has the government tried to address this? Well, very simple. You wanted to solve the problem in Odessa. Why wasn't the mayor of Odessa, Turhanov, who has a Russian passport, still has it, never renounced it, linked to organized crime, deep in the pockets of Russian organized crime, still running the city of Odessa? He set up the system by which Borisov was able to operate. So it's very elemental systems when you want to look at things like corrupt actors. So I just spent on the last trip in Ukraine 6 weeks trying to get the Ministry of Defense to get serious about dealing with the corruption issues, because the exact same scandals happen. Previous deputy minister found with a couch full of money. Nothing happened. It was announced, no, he got it from an old lady in Kharkiv. Honest to God. It was apparently he got $400,000 from an old lady in Kharkiv. He wasn't removed. Then the scandal breaks a couple of times again. And all of these things, these scandals within the Ministry of Defense and everything else, hurt Ukraine, especially from a strategic communications operation. How do you convince foreign donors that it really is worth investing in Ukraine at the moment when you're failing to remove the very people who are involved in stealing assistance? Half of humanitarian assistance in Dnieper and Kharkiv and other places, Zaporozhye, were direct NABU cases. Wagon loads of assistance to the Dnieper were taken. This is a NABU case. This is established. There's evidence there, right? So this is where it becomes highly problematic, is that the government should see that the threat of corruption is the number one threat in the country. The threat to reconstruction money is the number one threat in the country. You have 1.3 million veterans out there who are fighting for Ukraine. How is their view going to be when they learn that it was the same old game and that millions have been stolen? So when your son dies in the Donbass because another guy was able to buy his way into the military through Borisov, how do you explain that? So this is the problem that I see right now. The valiant nature of the Ukrainian forces, the great job that Ukrainians have done, and the resiliency that they've done is being undermined by a failure to have real political will to address the corruption issue. It's not a Russian narrative. It's not Russian propaganda, because if you talk to any Ukrainians, they'll say exactly the same thing. That's why the investigative journalists keep cranking out. We all had a period, and I met with some of the top anti-corruption journalists, some of whom are serving in the early days of the war. And we basically said, yes, we're not going to expose anything. We're going to keep track of things because it's not helping Ukraine. But instead of doing something with that grace that was given, that hasn't happened. So anti-corruption investigators and journalists are back on the case. So I think that it's a prime issue. It's a prime strategic communications issue that has to be dealt with, is that it has to be very visible and there have to be large scale initiatives done. And this was one thing that I was trying to push on the MOD. You need to do this. You should do this. It's for your own good. You need to have people that will be able to look transparently on what's going on in Ministry of Defense procurement.
Not to be cynical, but are there real alternatives? Can they actually do something? And are there the people who are both experienced and not corrupt who could be placed in those positions if the current set of corrupt actors is kicked out, given the long-standing and endemic nature of this problem?
Okay, so Turhanov is now on his 19th corruption case. He beat the last 18. Yeah, 19th. Justification for removal? Yes, it's existed. It existed since the very start of the war. That he's somebody who should not be in a critical Ukrainian city that is very much in the front lines. Why not remove him from power and remove that danger? Why not put extra efforts into ensuring that all of the assistance given is transparent as possible? They've come up with some nice digital things, and there's many activists and many goodwill people who are trying their hardest. But when it comes down to actually showing that there will be no tolerance of corrupt actors, arresting a former minister of infrastructure on very weak conditions did exactly the opposite. It didn't show a will to fight corruption. It showed a will to go after political opponents. So this actually backfired on the government with the Pivovarsky case and others, right? So, I mean, this has been the problem, is that there are two wars in Ukraine. One is against Russia and one is against corruption. If you fail at the corruption one, you may lose the war against Russia. And there are lots of people, there's lots of capable people, there's lots of people that could be held to account, there are good people that could be put in. But we've seen that one of the problems is the ruling party, Sluga Naroda, was a new party. They didn't have experienced people involved in it. And there seems to be a reluctance to take somebody who's not a party member and put them in those positions of power. That's the answer to your question, is that why not look out for people who have excelled in previous governments? and not tribalize this.
So there is this level of distrust between the previous political factions and the current government. What do you think is possible to do to bring those voices together and to overcome this distrust at least an individual level? Okay, Poroshenko was corrupt. Doesn't mean that everybody who was in every political position was also corrupt. How do you overcome this mindset that the past people are all enemies and the current set is no matter what their fault is, at least they're on the same team? This seems to be a problem, first of all over the world, not just in Ukraine, but in Ukraine they're fighting a war, therefore they can least afford this attitude at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, look, I wrote about this in the mid-90s, corruption, trust, and democracy in Ukraine. The fact is, Misha Midikov, a Ukrainian political scientist, did some brilliant work at looking at regionalism and the regional clans that exist. Who in the cabinet was not a member of Kvartal 95, the president's production company? Right, so it comes down to very elemental. This is a very small pool of people that you have close to you. Yes, the trust issue is difficult because it's very difficult to work with people that you don't trust and don't know. And knowing people is a prime driver of many things in Ukraine, right? Having that personal relationship. And this is where I find it very interesting, is that Westerners, when they come to Ukraine, don't understand the informal system is far stronger than the formal system. Nobody cares what your title is and whatever. They care who you are and if they've developed trust. I was working in the early days of the war, procuring and equipping for special forces with guys who I've known for a very long time. So I've known them for many years. This is why there was no nonsense. I knew them. I knew who they were. I knew that they wouldn't be involved in any dodgy stuff. So I was more than happy to help them. Yes, personal relationships are important. But the point is, again, of institutionalizing these things and giving ministers, by the way, one of the few ministers who wasn't involved is Denis Maluska, the Minister of Justice. Right. So, I mean, this is the thing, is that you have a technocrat government would be one of the ways to deal with this. Just pick people. And that sort of happened in 2014. There were some technocrats brought in to the government. So you saw people from Microsoft or wherever else who were brought in to do this. So for all the mistakes of Poroshenko, he did one smart thing about tapping into a pool beyond his own inner circle. But should it be done now? Yes, it should be done now. But again, it's very difficult in the psychological sort of circle that the executive finds itself in, is that they were in the bunker together. Right, so they survived the first months of the war. That bonded them in a way, and so it becomes very difficult for them to let others in. But it is critically important, and they're largely dependent now, at least financially, on Western assistance. Not militarily, but financially, very much on Western assistance. So there is the lever in terms of the Western donors saying that, you know, look, we support you, we're with you 100%, but you really have to clean house. And you have to let others in.
So you have this leverage, you have the West facing a dilemma. On the one hand, they want to support Ukraine's survival, and that requires some sort of a larger institutional integration of Ukraine with the countries and Europe and Western institutions. You cannot just isolate the country and expect it to go at it alone. On the other hand, you want, in order for that to happen, this corruption issue and has to be tackled. So how do you balance putting that pressure and making sure that this job gets done, but also ensuring that it does not, this internal process does not take the actual war process hostage? How do you ensure that the war effort needs are still being met and directed properly, while also putting pressuring the government into doing the right thing? Where do you find the trust that comes with that? Because right now, a lot of these relationships seem to be very transactional for all the support that NATO has given, and it has given very substantial amounts of support, which even from its own interests, it is reluctant to waste by then breaking away and turning its back. But there doesn't seem to be necessarily. There's been all sorts of issues. US has given a huge amount of aid, but it has taken time to ramp it up. And initially, it was reluctant. It was essentially had written Ukraine off. So have many other countries. And this sort of kind of, trust building effort itself undermines the leverage Western countries have to pressure Ukraine on anti-corruption internal measures. So where do you find the trust, and where do you find this kind of internal way of communicating this need in a way that will be heard and not essentially turned into a propaganda talking point against the West in this measure?
Yes, and this has been one of the problems. Look at what happened in Vilnius. Vilnius, from a strategic communications point of view, was a complete disaster. So stomping your feet and demanding the NATO countries get directly militarily involved in a fight with Russia was never going to happen. The Ukraine side knew this. So why would you go out and again bash NATO? And I've said this to many Ukrainian activists, bashing NATO in the West doesn't help your cause. And in fact, it has the opposite effect. So what you've done is the people who have saved you currently, not during the Battle of Kiev, when Ukraine saved itself with no real military assistance and everything else. The Battle of Kiev was won, so the war was won by Ukrainians on Ukrainians. But since then, tons of material, millions of tons of material have been delivered to Ukraine from NATO countries in the US. So bashing them and saying that you're not helping us doesn't help the Ukrainian cause, and it's terrible in terms of strategic communication. That's not how you make allies, right? This is kind of like the de Gaulle situation during World War II. And so it's just from a strategic communications point of view, I don't understand what this NATO bashing does. So yes, has the US dragged its feet on assistance? Yes. Did they have, the response they should have in the run-up? They knew the invasion was going to happen. But yet, one of the reasons why Zelensky said, okay, if that's true, where's the airlift? Where's the tons of material dropping in? So yes, there was a very slow, and the point is yes, Canada, the US, and other countries had completely written off Ukraine. I had some very strong arguments with people. And I just said, look, I'm sorry, but you've never seen the Ukrainian forces in action, and you've never seen the Russian forces in action if you think Russia could win, especially in the Battle of Kiev. So it was clear. The unreformed Russian army was not going to storm in and take Kiev. But the problem has been since then there's a constant same attitude is that you must give us everything we want now. Well, that's not how you get things. So if Western countries are helping you, should be very clear that yes, thank you for the assistance. Can we get more? Can we get more of what we need? So for example, all of this political energy spent on F-16s. Would F-16s change the battlefield, which is a land battlefield, right? More air defense would definitely help the people down in Odessa getting hammered every night. So more air defense and things like that. And there was actually General Miley, the former head of the US forces, made the case very clear. They need more ammunition, they need more air defense, they need very basic stuff. But there's been all of this political sort of games and things like that and cheerleading on the issue when it should be much calmer argued points of saying, look, we need this, here's the justification for this. Anytime in international development that a beneficiary has needed something, they have to justify it. So just saying, we need to defeat the Russians isn't a carte blanche to get everything you want. So there should be looking at what are the capacities, what do we need, what can we use, what can we maintain, right? This has been one of the big issues. One of the things that is left out of this entire discussion is where's the Ukrainian ammunition factory? Discussed for 9 years. So since 2014, and there was a Kiev Independent article that did it, and just had one little note that said, One time in 2018, we tried to set up an ammo factory. It's just not true. It was discussed about from 2015 onwards of setting up a Ukrainian ammunition factory. But the fact is, corruption got in the way. And that's what the Kiev Independent article wrote about. And then there was people, grifters from the US and from Canada who got involved as well. And still this ammunition factory was not set up. The Lviv tank factory, that was the first corruption case that I sort of brought in on my own. And that was clear what was going on, still wasn't dealt with in 2015, and only later on in 2017, 2018 was it sort of dealt with, but that would have increased the capacity. So on this front, I just think that the strategic communications point of view should be is that, look, we're in a very difficult situation. We're trying all our can. Please help. We understand you've been doing. But to expect that the public in the rest of the world is going to fight the Russians is just completely unrealistic. And what I find most funny is the biggest cheerleaders for this are not guys who are willing to go and fight themselves. So they're willing to commit other people's boys to this. Fact is, Ukrainians have been doing a fantastic job. There's lots of things they still need. There's lots of ways to help them. But this dialogue between the Ukraine and the West and everything else has been extremely dysfunctional from the public view. From the private view of what I've discussed with some of the diplomats, even worse. So, so I just think that there's a need for engagement in a different level and a different attitude within the administration to say, we need to, make our case very clear. We need help. We're defending the West. All of that stuff is very legitimate. Ukraine is fighting for the West. Yes, you are. But you can't expect the West is going to send boys to fight for you. But we can send you everything we have. And in some cases, like in the Baltic states, they've sent all they have. They have nothing left. There's nothing left in the warehouses. Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovakia. Some of the other countries are sending everything they can. Poland, huge heroes delivering. The United States has sent a huge amount of material, right? So people were saying you have to send ATACMS. Well, they have 3,000 ATACMS in their entire arsenal. So if they send all of those, then if another crisis breaks out in the world, then what? So, I mean, it just has to be a bit of realism mixed with the actual situation and base it on real needs and functionality. What are the capacities? What is needed? How can this best be used? It's like with my arguments with all of these small NGOs running around trying to help Ukraine. It's incredibly inefficient. There are lots of big NGOs who do this work. Why not be part of that? Right? You buying and delivering yourself is just a waste of resources. You buy one set of night vision equipment when you could buy 10 if you teamed up with other people. So, I mean, that's just where sort of we are in terms of this. And I see that this anti-Western, anti-NATO message that's constantly being hammered only serves Russian interests. It doesn't serve Ukraine's.
At the same time, there is also, this unreasonable expectation on some of the larger Western countries, putting all of this burden on the smaller countries like the Baltic states and the Czech Republic that you just mentioned. So this is kind of also a different point. Ukraine's unrealistic, arguments is one point, but the West also putting all the burden on smaller countries, that is also not really sustainable, and it's just not. I think it's fair to push NATO in general to meet its defense obligations, but at the same time, you have to understand who the people not meeting those obligations are and confront them, as opposed to put more of the burden on the ones who are already doing more than their share. I'm not entirely sure where US, Canada, and others can lead in that, given that there's been such a polarizing debate inside the administration here on how to do that. And that brings us to the elephant in the room, which is the counter-offensive. I think the expectations from this counter-offensive, especially as reported by the media in the West, have been unrealistic, to put it mildly. I think people expected Ukraine to just come in and drive Russians out in a matter of 2 or 3 months, which obviously hasn't and is not going to happen. So where does that leave us with the expectations, with the plan? Where are we with regards to that?
So the big leak of Ukrainian intelligence that was given out, well, intelligence on Ukraine that was given out, made it very clear. The expectations were within the NATO countries of very low in terms of the counteroffensive. So where do these expectations come from? Well, they come from a lot of cheerleaders who have never been in Ukraine. Couldn't find Ukraine on a map a year and a half ago. Having seen what the Donbass front lines look like in the first phase of the war, why have there been no big movements through that contact line? Because it's defense after defense lines that are set up and very strong. So the same thing. This stuff takes a lot of time. It's very difficult, right? So I mean, I don't think there was any sort of big expectations on the Ukrainian side. I don't think there was any big expectations in terms of Western governments. So who was making these pronouncements that, oh, the counteroffensive is not going as good as it was expected? Who was expecting differently? Not the people that actually know these things. So this is the big issue, is that I don't think that anybody who actually knows the situation on the ground thought that there would be a massive breakout like they had in Kharkiv. It's just extremely unrealistic, right? And Ukraine needs artillery shells. That's just the fact of it. It needs artillery shells. The production in Europe is not on doing 3 ships a day. Some plants in the US are on 3 ships a day, trying to restock what has been given. So it exists. But again, expecting that other countries are going to go to full-scale production in order to benefit a third country, I don't know. I mean, you can criticize the Europeans, you can especially criticize the Canadians. We hollowed out our military for many decades, right? We hollowed it out. So when it came to giving Leopard tanks, we had maybe 20 operational Leopard tanks. We gave 8, right? So I mean, that was just a part of the reality. Yes, we ourselves fell asleep in the West. We've been asleep since 2014. 2014 should have been a wake-up call. 2008 invasion of Georgia. If the Obama administration had very quickly reacted to that, the Russian army was in disarray even against a small opponent like Georgia. The investments made in the Georgian military were fairly limited, and it wasn't very serious effort. Yes, they sent some guys to war zones and stuff like that. But the reality is that if there had been a strong Western response in 2008 and in 2014, and I was in Kiev at that time, and I saw how weak the response was, things might be different now, right? We didn't ramp up production. So now we're in a case of where Ukraine desperately needs more artillery shells to bring this fight farther forward. Wishing for these Wunderwaffen and that you're going to have all of these magical things and B-2 stealth bombers or whatever else just is, nonsense. From a strategic point of view, it's really about getting them as many armored vehicles and as many artillery shells as possible. And the problem is globally on many types of equipment, they're tapped out. So yes, have the large Western powers put more pressure on the smaller neighbors to do this, but the stakes are much higher for the Baltics and Poland, Czechia and Slovakia. Yeah? The stakes are much higher in this fight. Convincing people in France that they should be spending a bigger part of their gross domestic product or gross national product on arms is a hard sell, especially with the Russian penetration of the far right. The fact is that Germany and France and other countries have had a massive penetration by Russian influence operations. So you have a big chunk of the population who doesn't support many of the efforts. So this is one of the big issues. I didn't have any big expectations for the counteroffensive to be able to have an emergency breakout. People say we have all these strategic reserves, or that Russia has all these strategic reserves. Ignores still the fact that you have to get through huge lines of defense and huge minefields to be able to move forward. Ukraine's making some successes, but it's coming at a huge loss, right? And this has been the other side of it, is that the ability, for example, to care for wounded soldiers and those that have been disabled is massive. And this is where the next sort of, large international effort should focus on, is rehabilitating people and getting soldiers from the front lines that are wounded and getting them treated. Ukraine has done a fantastic job at it. They don't leave their wounded in the field, right? But still, it's been highly problematic to face up with a large mechanized army and come away without huge losses. So yeah, more that should be done in the counteroffensive. You want to support it? More artillery shells, more armored vehicles. That's what Ukraine needs. And I don't believe in this, that it has to be Leopards or it has to be M1s. Where are those M1s, by the way? So the reality is any armored vehicle that can be modernized and used is an advantage. So people turning up their noses and saying, no, we don't need T-72s. Well, the T-72s that were renovated in Ukraine were actually incredibly efficient, better thermal sights and better shells in them. So, that's what's needed. And I think that the counteroffensive will drag on and it'll come at more losses. But there might be a breakout in one area, given the disarray on the Russian side.
So speaking of that disarray, there's been some analysis of how Russia has been able to adjust and adapt over time. And the longer the war drags on, the more they'll be able to find their ways around the initial losses and rebuild and, kind of overcome some of the issues that caused the disarray to begin with. I don't know if they'll be able to get rid of all the corrupt generals and replace them easily, but, and people who looted the budget, but they will be able to find new allies. They certainly can gain access to materials to start rebuilding some of the things that they were dependent on from the West. So how do we overcome that problem? The fact that the longevity of the war benefits Russia's ability to overcome its initial weaknesses.
Yeah, I mean, there's been this misnomer of many people who don't know the region, don't know anything about the region, that all Russians are stupid. Well, no, and that's not true, right? So trying to pretend that the Russians are a bunch of idiots and drunk and whatever else, and crazy guys in Ushankas running around, no. It's an incredibly corrupt and inefficient system, which is an autocracy, right? And the problem has been is that when everybody's lying to you all the time, you tend to believe that, right? Putin doesn't read any social media at all. Why? He doesn't trust social media. Everything has to be printed out and given to him and briefed by individuals. That's the only way that he'll accept information. So the fact is that the Russian military machine was incredibly inefficient, incredibly corrupt, and they paid the price for it. Are they able at this point to do real reforms within the Ministry of Defense? I'm skeptical, but I can see that at the tactical level, they've learned. They learned in Afghanistan. Soviet forces in Afghanistan learned. They adapted, right? The fact is that this is Russia's game now. Is that they're trying to drag this on for longer, so it works in their advantage. So I mean, these are just one of the sort of misnomers is that Russia is incapable of doing better. They can. Are they capable of reform? Doubtful, mostly because of the personnel involved, right? So this has been one of the problems is that the people that are involved are largely Soviet type officers who are still in. So yeah, I think that expecting that things will go Ukraine's way forever. And this was great. A Ukrainian friend of mine who works exclusively on defense issues made a great point. So she said that, yes, the West greatly underestimated our abilities before, and now they're greatly overestimated our abilities, right? So that's just the cold, hard reality. Ukrainians realize that they are in a slow grind and they need all the support they can get to be able to move forward. But I just think that currently this way of building will to help Ukraine hasn't been done very effectively. I think more engagement, and so one of the things I think would be great is if the conservative Ukrainians would engage much more with conservative Americans in the Republican Party. A friend of mine came to me with a project to build a Reagan statue in Kiev. I thought it was great. Because who's done more to fight the Soviet Union than Ronald Reagan, right? And so this is the Hearts and Minds campaign that needs to be focused on, is who you are addressing in these countries, how to bring them on board. The fact is, Ukraine as flavor of the month is going to wear out. So people who supported Ukraine don't know anything about Ukraine, but it's the current issue of the day. Tomorrow it might be something else. What you do need to do is to make the case to many people in countries is that this is in your narrow interest. And I think that case needs to be made much more. And especially in terms of the counteroffensive, to say, look, it's a slow grind. So it's going to cost a lot of lives. It's going to require more assistance, and it's going to require more of your national budgets to dedicate it to helping Ukraine. Stomping your feet and demanding it isn't going to be the way, but making a case of why this is real is the most important.
So one of the issues here that I find myself grappling with as I watch, these arguments being made is the issue of basic survival has obviously been prioritized, and for good reason. But that has pushed the humanitarian needs of the population to the back burner to some extent. And it is not a popular cause, particularly among conservatives who basically view humanitarian aid as a waste of money and prefer to focus most of the assistance on the military aid to put an end to all of this sooner. The reality is, even if we were to give 100% of all the military aid, the war probably would not end tomorrow or the day after. It would still take time to wrap things up, even in the best case scenario. And the humanitarian needs are not going anywhere. How do we make this humanitarian case more of a priority in terms of the fact that it needs to be addressed, and that that it is no less essential than the military assistance?
Well, it's not more essential than the military assistance, but it's in also people's interests. What we learned in the first phase of the war, when I was working in Donbass, is that early recovery work in terms of helping people get back on their feet is critical. Why? Well, it keeps people there, and there are a lot of people who don't want to move, right? So you had the first waves of people who left Ukraine were those that were mobile, that were young, they were able to reestablish their lives elsewhere and whatever else. So what you've done is a lot of people just refuse to leave their communities for a number of very valid reasons. It's what they know. And it's not very easy when you're 50 to restart your life someplace overseas with a language you don't understand. So the fact is, people are going to stay in Ukraine. There is a need for people to stay in Ukraine, and to be able to help them stay in Ukraine, get them back on their feet economically. I always tell the example, we tried for months to get one simple dairy farm up and operating outside of Kharkiv. This dairy farm employed 500 people in a town of 2,000. So the indirect jobs were the entire population of the town. So this town simply would have been able to recover very easily for a small investment of about 70,000. Right? Donors weren't in that mode. They were in the emergency humanitarian delivery mode, which is unsustainable because those food packages don't come in the right frequency and for the right volume to be able to keep communities alive. But having your own money, and there's no shortage of food in Ukrainian supermarkets. It's not Somalia, right? You can buy 3 types of lobster in Kiev. So it's really not a problem that there's food, but people need to have the income to be able to afford that food. So focusing on livelihoods is critical at the moment. Getting early recovery going is critical. And what it'll do is it'll keep the populations inside Ukraine. And this is in the very narrow interest of European countries. Yes, Poland has greatly benefited by replacing all the people who went to the UK by Ukrainians. This was happening before the war. It happened as soon as there was visa-free regime, right? And so a lot of Ukrainians. And they're getting workers who are better skilled than those that they replaced. But still, you see the creaking of the system already and the dissatisfaction of many of these waves of Ukrainians who have come. The fact is, the majority of Ukrainians probably would like to keep staying in Ukraine, but they need to have a viable option to stay there. And what we've seen is how resilient people are. So many people came back to the Kiev region, gone on with their lives, rebuilt Irpin, Bucha, and the rest of these towns. And life goes on like it did before. And so that needs to be applied in other places across the country.
Well, that also brings us to an issue you pointed out earlier. The fact is, while all of this is happening, where people are trying to fight these multiple different issues in multiple fronts, Russia, because it does not have to deal with this internal dynamic, has the resources to continue meddling in other countries' affairs and to continue capitalizing on these real, imagined, and fabricated concerns. Some of which, as you pointed out, exist on the ground, just enough propaganda talking points. Regardless, Russia is great of capitalizing on both, and you have this penetration of parties that were previously fringe and that are now becoming increasingly mainstream in a lot of the West. And you have all the campaigns and issues and simple distractions and just all these things that splinter public opinion. There seems to be no cohesive approach. That this is a real problem, regardless of Ukraine itself. It's a problem for the governments that live there, and a way to fight that without also infringing on freedoms of speech or breeding further distrust of the government institutions. So how do we grapple with that? How do we get the targeted groups themselves, including the right-wing contingent, to understand and self-reflect and understand that this is a problem for them and not just for their opponents?
Is it possible to convince, and there's been scientific studies that have shown this, if somebody's convinced in their beliefs, you can't change their mind by any logic or anything else. The fact is, for 30 years, I would argue, nothing changed since the collapse of the Soviet Union, is that the West has been the target of Soviet and then Russian information operations. Those information operations continue. Can you make the point of trying to win over people, especially after the last intensive 15 years of Russian information operations in the West? I don't know. Are you going to convince some AfD guy that no, the Russians are the bad guys? I don't know. But what you can do is convince the average person who has a centrist type of view is that you could bring them over to see that it's in their interest. One of the problems has been is that Russia targets the political extremes, far left and the far right, because it knows that it can very easily, if you're conspiracy minded, it's very easy to win you over. So I think that one of the problems has been is that convincing the average, farmer in the US, if he had a chance to understand what the Ukraine fight was really about, or engage with other Ukrainians who are farmers, right? Mm-hmm. Or religious leaders in the US who are able to engage with other religious leaders, they would find out that, guess what? Ukrainians are a lot more like us than we think. The betrayal in the media that Ukraine is a very hip and progressive place. It is. It is in Kiev, very hip and progressive. It is in other major cities, very hip and progressive. But if you ask the average Ukrainian about many social issues, they would be right in line with any other sort of average citizen in France, Germany, or wherever else. They're focused on taxes, and they don't like they don't like the government in their case, and they just want to go on with their lives. And the fact is that they really don't care about people's identity or gender politics, right? Mm-hmm. So this has been one of the things that has been a massive fail, is that trying to counter the Russian narrative that, all these progressives are a bad thing by trying to say, no, we're super embracing those progressive values and things, ignores the reality of Ukraine. Fact is, the average Ukrainian is not that radically progressive. And the survey evidence done over the last 15 years show that. I mean, their value systems are fairly aligned. They're just far more resilient than Western countries have been. I mean, look at how the pandemic made everything collapse. I'm just amazed in Canada. I said, a minor sort of epidemic with a low level of lethality made many institutions almost collapse because of people's reactions. whereas a major war in Ukraine people managed to keep chugging on, and it becomes from, the last 50 years of Ukrainian history in which they've learned how to be resilient on these things. So the point is that I think if you want to counter this influence and bring more citizens on board, it would be just show actually what Ukrainian average citizens are like, what the country's like, and what they're fighting for, and make that case of this is why we're in this fight for our existence. I think a lot of the hyperbole and everything else and cheerleading has been unproductive in terms of building a consensus in many countries. You have a small group of people who are very vocal. And especially I find it very, there's a lot of people on Twitter or wherever very vocal about their support for Ukraine. They've never been there, probably never will go there. They don't understand anything about the country. And so how long can you keep that up, right? At some point, then you get distracted by something else, Taiwan or whatever. So I think right now, a smart strategy would be to try to engage as much as possible ordinary Ukrainians with ordinary Europeans or North Americans. And what we've seen is that the migrants that come have been that. So the first time in people's lives they met a Ukrainian was, as they came after during the course of the last year and a half.
I think there's a lot of truth to what you're saying, but at the same time, there is also been not enough effort to disrupt the narratives themselves by the Russians, and we're talking about both by the West and by Ukraine and by there's been a lot of counter propaganda in terms of the most basic talking points like the Nazis and whatever. Not nearly enough, by the way, because it's actually becoming more successful in certain media circles in the US thanks to the influx of money. There hasn't been, it's almost like, okay, Russia is a very opaque place. There's, the foreign NGOs have been kicked out, so we can't really do anything. It's like everyone has given up to try to influence the public opinion or just embarrass the local leadership. So what in your opinion is doable at the moment? What should be done and what sort of efforts should be pushed, and why, in your opinion, is there such a reluctance to engage in more aggressive strategic communications and psyops and things that really can do damage to the other side psychologically and kind of create the chaos we can exploit?
But that's two completely different questions. So the strategic communication side of it from Ukraine to other countries externally, yes, there's a lot that can be done, again, based on not trying to shame people or whatever else or yell and scream, but just to make the case. The other side of it about psyops within Russia, this is the thing, is that the easiest way for Ukraine to get battlefield success is going to distract Russia. We had a little bit of that Prigozhin, but it wasn't exploited at the time. Was there some psyops involved? Probably. But the fact is, you have across the Russian Federation a lot of groups who are not satisfied with their positions within the Russian Federation. Are those groups being supported? Not at all. So I talk to them almost on a daily basis. Those that are willing to conduct information operations inside Russia, and they are not being supported in any substantive way, right? If you want to go after, the North Caucasus groups or Central Asians inside Russia or elsewhere, is anybody funding those type of operations? No. So the great myth that somehow, this cabal of intelligence agencies are always up to sneaky stuff, you can see it on the ground. There is no intended information operations that are currently ongoing. For example, among the easy targets within Russia, it's not going to be the oligarchs. All the oligarchs in power right now are there because of Putin. It's not going to be the military. There are some very dissatisfied people, but I don't think they're going to reach out to the West for support. But there is a lot of ethnic groups inside Russia, and that's what people fail to realize. That you have Bashkirs, you have Buryats, you have Dagestanis, you have everybody under the sun who has no real love for Moscow. And those are points that could be exploited much better. But there are no resources. right? So that's been one of the problems, and very frustrating, is that I know some of the guys in Ukraine who would like to push much more on this issue, but there hasn't been that level of engagement with the groups inside Russia. The Free Russian Legion or whatever else, yes, it started off as a strictly PR exercise, but then they actually developed some capacity. And you have a large number of Belarusians or Russians now that are willing to fight. Before, they weren't supported, they weren't given the resources, but they scare the hell out of Moscow, right? So doing much more work in that area would be a big benefit, and it would be one of the things, as we saw with the Prigozhin. So for a couple of days, Russian operations were very much hampered by this whole show. Was it simply political theater? I don't think so. Too many things have happened since then to show that there was something real to this. Is there a large dissatisfaction within Russia? Yes, and that could be exploited.
The U.S. policy in particular, and I can't speak for the countries, but U.S. In its approach to engaging with opposition groups, whether it's Russia, China, or Iran, who all of these three states are multi-ethnic, diverse, and very much ethnocentric societies where minorities tend to face discriminatory attitude. U.S. In particular has been very much focused on mainstream opposition from mainstream ethnic groups that are largely politically affiliated with one or two leading parties or streams of opposition that everyone knows about and supports. And that has also been U.S. policy all over the Middle East with disastrous results. I must say, Iraq being one of them, Yemen, everybody. U.S. tends to put its eggs in one basket, no matter how disastrous that basket may be. If you're talking about in Russia specifically, the whole thing with Navalny has been adopted as the one and only official storyline, to the exclusion of all other possible narratives, lines of engagement, and so forth. So I tend to think that maybe other countries can be a little bit more flexible, but they are also not leaders on this issue. So how do we overcome this political obsessiveness with whoever is being proposed the main voice for everybody, whether or not that is really the case?
Yeah, I mean, part of it comes from the black and white thinking. And we saw this for example, into the Western approach to Afghanistan. Massoud, who was the #1 fighter, wasn't supported. Other groups were. Why? Because they had representatives that could look like Westerners, act like Westerners, talk like Westerners. It's always been the case. US policy in Ukraine is dictated by a very small number of people. They only listen to a couple of voices and have listened to a couple of voices since 2014. The same thing in Russia. Well, they know Navalny. So that's the guy. So who else has been negotiating or talking? Not from the State Department side. Definitely. I mean, if you really want to in-depth discuss this, I would talk to my friend Magomed Toriev. Magomed is an Ingush guy who is involved in strategic communications for the Ukrainian forces, but also he's an active fighter as well. Yeah, he's a English that ran away to the Czech Republic, and then he was on the OSCE monitoring mission in Ukraine and things like that. So here's somebody who knows very much from inside Russia what is the reality. The reality is, if you want to have people rise up and make problems, there's very few mobilizers, and that's what we saw exactly with the Prigozhin incident. Is that when the Prigozhin started his sort of march to Moscow, you didn't see a lot of people coming in and joining. Right? This wasn't Stepan Razin for sure, because this was one of the problems, is that Putin, especially since 2012, has made sure that there is nobody who can mobilize people to oppose it. The 2012 protest very clearly scared the Kremlin, and then they spent a lot of energy co-opting and making sure that nobody would be able to oppose them since then. So it's very big problem is there are very few people inside Russia who would be able to mobilize, but there are people outside of Russia with whom Western countries could work with. .
And that's actually very much a conversation that I would like to have, because there is these voices
Yeah.
are not being heard, and I see the same 10 people writing for foreign policy, and foreign policy has its own perspective and sources of funding that so when you have a lack of diversity in thinking, you tend to end up in a groupthink bubble that tends to
Yes.
get manipulated by your enemies. You become a target of psyops when you over rely on
Yeah.
one source of information. That's just generally the
Yes.
case,
I
and that's exactly what I feel like the
agree.
entire narrative has been driven by particular interests, and those interests, once they became successful, were able to continue driving the narrative that has not served anyone well, and has actually prevented Ukrainians themselves from effectively engaging with the West. Their voices are not being heard sufficiently. The diverse voices from Ukraine are being being dominated by these few kind of Western style activists who are
Yeah, I
uh,
agree absolutely, and it's always been a case of this, and where because I know the country, I travel around, I speak the languages, so it's easy for me to talk to people. But I'm just always amazed at what the same people stating the same things, and what I love best is the loudest ones who are crying are those who are not even inside Ukraine. You go and talk to people who are actually on the ground, and this has been the problem: is that you're relying on people who look like you, would sound like you, and everything else for your sources of information, and just from an information gathering. That's one of the reasons why I'm so excited about my new position, is because we can do research and analysis and talk to anybody, including people in occupied territories or people in frontline communities. Right? Data that is very much needed now by Western countries to make policy decisions.
So let's talk a little bit about your organization. What exactly does it do? How is it different from the myriads of NGOs operating both on the ground and in the larger information sphere concerning Ukraine? And how is it able to engage with these diverse voices to gain the trust and to produce accurate analysis of these concerns?
Well, there aren't a myriad of organizations. There's, in terms of people who are doing conflict analysis, that is actually evidence driven and not open source. There's actually very few organizations that
Mhm.
exist. Most of those organizations don't have operational backgrounds. We're trying to help those that are actually implementing programs and doing it from that perspective of what information do you need to affect your operations. So it's very different. And this has been one of the problems in the past, is that sadly, a lot of Ukrainian think tanks were funded by oligarchs. So a lot of the people who came up through the system are used to, okay, what do you want me to say? All right, so let me write that. Right. So in terms of getting strictly analytical uh, views on this, or gathering the information, and the information needs to take you wherever it's going to go. I did the same thing. I went up and did primary interviews in Kharkov, in the newly liberated territories. Unfortunately, a lot of the donors didn't want to hear that. They wanted to hear very close narrative, but that's not the reality. So yeah, I mean, what we're trying to do now is work with different stakeholders in terms of developing much more data-driven stories. Especially excited about working more with the media. If the media wants to cover a story, then they can actually go and they can get the information, and from that information make their story, instead of quoting whatever some guy on Twitter said last week. Right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, this is not, the level of expertise. If you don't speak the languages, if you have no understanding of the country and everything else, is that somebody who should have an opinion? And I think you really need to have data to drive this. So what's missing out is granular information that organizations can use to inform their operations. And that's what's needed now. And that's not what's going on. There are some organizations that collect internally for their own use, but they don't spread it out and they don't share with others. So it's very limited, it's very siloed, a lot of the information.
How do you expect to reach the decision makers who have been reluctant to engage with anyone who is not part of the familiar kind of cliques on the issue of Ukraine, and we can see that the action policy, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of engaging with policymakers, the Ukrainian government is not going to be our primary sort of client for sure. They have their own means to collect information on this, but for the Western donors, it's just, this is what we're trying to make the case, is you need to hear things that you've never heard. Back in 2016, I started this, what I called kitchen table discussions in Kiev when I was with UNDP. And so what we would do is every week invite people who never talk to each other, ever. So Ukrainian NGOs, donors, experts, and sit around, have a nice meal and a couple of bottles of wine and everything else, and discuss issues, just like we used to do in Soviet, early post-Soviet times, right? Discussing around the kitchen table, solving all of the world's problems, right? And this then would be, and people afterwards said, well, that was great. I've never participated in something like this, because all they ever do is work through this transactional relationship. I give you money, you tell me stuff, and that's it. Instead of just sitting around like friends and discussing very contrary sometimes opinions about things. So I think that that's what's needed right now, is just getting people to listen to others who they normally wouldn't listen to. And that would then drive policy. Policy, sadly, from the international donors since 2014 has been driven a lot by just, a small group of activists who were the only primary source for a lot of this. And they would rotate between government service, NGOs, donors, and then back, and constantly this revolving door. So one time when we were discussing, sort of our transparent procurement system, I discussed this with the guys, and they said, we. And I said, who's we? The NGO who started this, the Ministry of Economy, the donor you currently work for? So who's we? So I just think that there is need to be this diversity of voices, and there needs to be an ability to collect and use that in terms of policy making. Will people take it? I don't know. You can always hope, right, that people will. But, at least we're there as an instrument to be able to try.
Well, I love that idea. I think Washington could use a lot more of that to kind of overcome this sort of, internal bubble, among themselves and others. First of all, among themselves, and then between Washington and other states. And because U.S. seems to be drifting apart due to these, echo chambers and refusing to confront the reality that there are different opinions and perspectives, and not all of them are completely illegitimate. What can be done to facilitate the same sort of? Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, the core of the problem is a lack of regional studies, right? We ignored the post-Soviet space for a long time. Everybody was a Middle East expert. So we intentionally got rid of that capacity in Western countries to understand, and those that had their own networks and sources of information, we got away from that. That's been a problem with the intelligence agencies, and over-reliance on signals intelligence instead of human intelligence, is that, just being able to go out and talk to people sometimes is a great source, much better than just listening to what they're saying on the phone. So I think that one of the problems is a lack of regional expertise. I can tell you, sitting in Kiev, 2014 to 2020, the number of people who actually had any background in the region were extremely limited. Roman Moshuk, our Canadian ambassador, was one of the few, spoke both Russian and Ukrainian, could go anywhere, talk to people. And that's why he was seen as the sort of dean of the international community for exactly that reason, right? But very few people on the ground, and especially very few people over at Sikorsky 4, the US Embassy, who had that same sort of depth of background, right? And this is the problem, you rotate people in, right? You rotate people in every 2 years or 4 years or whatever else. And so by the time they get to know a country, they're out. So this regional expertise has been lost, and we did it to ourselves. We got rid of our capacity. And that's why so many people were so wrong on things over the last 9 years, for simply that reason, is that we lack the technical expertise in the region.
You just gave me this idea how to kind of bring together the 2 points that you were making: the need for this regional understanding on the one hand, and for for engagement between regular, diverse Ukrainians and regular Americans. Why not recreate a version of these kitchen tables, at least online, between different groups, kind of bringing together some of the stakeholders you interview or study and identify their counterparts from the industries or based on regional areas in the United States, and create these Zoom calls or whatever you want to do with the small groups of people, just to have a discussion on the topic. And when it becomes feasible, maybe also do something less virtual and more kind of in person. We bring people to here who are not the usual activists.
No, I agree 100%. And the technology exists. It's not like, back in 1990 when you'd have these TV shows, so they had these TV shows between Phil Donahue and the Soviet Union, and, it was all staged and everything else. But the technology exists. Yes, I agree. The more that people engage, the more. So this was the idea that we had post 2014, was also to set up a summer camp where you would bring people, come, and they would get to know Ukraine. Because if you're going to learn, I mean, there's no hipper place in the world than Kiev. And so once people come there, they're like, what? It's not a bombed out shell and people walking around in, furs. And when the hipster almost runs you over on his e-scooter as his way to his local espresso bar, you get to understand the realities of it. So yes, the more people that get engaged, the better it is. But this was also one of the problems in the early stages of the war. Many people came to Ukraine thinking that Ukrainian forces would treat Western volunteers as rock stars and that it was going to look like their forces. So they came, they got very disappointed that they weren't treated in a very super special way, and then went away and badmouthed Ukraine, just because they simply didn't know the country, didn't know the languages, didn't know what was being said to them. So the misperceptions. So the more that you can engage directly, sure. I mean, there's so many Ukrainians already in Europe and in North America. Why not get them to do more Ukrainian nights and things like that? That's what we did as soon as we got back. We did a Ukrainian night here just to try to introduce the people in my small town. Is basically, here's what Ukraine is, here's what the war's about. Yeah. And it would be peanuts in terms of resources to be able to do. So it's a great idea.
That's actually not bad. And there are Ukrainian communities in New York, around Washington, and Chicago. It's very doable. But also getting people from kind of, getting more industry specific, like the farmers situation. A lot of people in kind of, agriculture based states and areas, not, even, places like New York have farms and things like that. They don't really have access to this kind of international communication, not because they don't have internet, but because they just don't know people there. And the focus has been very Washington centric.
Well, that's why I actually developed this idea during my first trip to Ukraine. We can actually give the electoral districts in the US, which have Republicans, for example, or conservative sort of representatives that could be targeted. Right. So this is it. Mm-hmm. It's just the same thing. A lot of people are sitting on the fence just because they don't understand Ukraine. The more engagement you directly have with these people, the better it is. Sorry, I'm going to have to run pretty soon. It's my shift for the baby.
This was actually my last question. I hope that we could continue the discussion later, because I think it is time to start getting these ideas into different gear and getting broader engagement on all of this before it's too, well, I wouldn't say too late, but until more damage is done and more time passes and more opportunities are lost. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I certainly hope to follow up on some of these angles and at least explore them as a journalist in conversations, and hopefully give also people who watch this a different perspective on matters from what they may hear in the news or from just online. And for those who have been watching, this was the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. We'll be back next Tuesday at 9 p.m. And thank you for watching us. Donald Browser was here talking about all things Ukraine, really, from the corruption efforts to the expectations for the counteroffensive to humanitarian, social, and the informational needs related to the war. And thank you so much for joining us. Have a great night.
Great, thanks. Talk to you soon.